Yeah, so to start off, there we go. So to start off, I'm looking at any official word is going to come from the school as far as the school being closed or open, okay? But, I mean, you can probably figure out from what they're all saying that there's a good chance that, here's the track. I'm looking on the computer, on the other, come on, reload. Well, anyway, we're going to get a lot of stuff, that's for sure. So this is not cooperating right now. Of course it's not. But just keep looking at the LSC website, and that'll give it more information in terms of whether things are going to be open. Let me look at it real quick right now. Like I said, the last time we did, oh, here we go. Here's a bulletin, an update. It's probably going to say we don't know anything right yet. Okay, yeah. So they haven't made the decision yet to close the school, but do keep an eye on that. Now, unfortunately, what that does for us, yeah, because you guys are the Monday, that's right, Monday classes, it kind of puts us behind. But anyway, I'll take care of all that. Don't worry about getting behind. Don't worry about labs or anything like that. If it becomes necessary that we have to cancel a lab because we can't just fit it in, then we can do that. But we will make sure that, or I will make sure I get in as much as I can. When it comes to lecture, I'll get all the lecture in. Don't worry about that. I'm like hydrogen bonds, in water molecules. I was talking about that today with my students, like springs. My semester, I always have these short and long areas in which I can expand or contract into with my lectures. So don't worry about any of that. If we don't do something in lab, I'm not going to ask in the lab exam. So, things like that are obvious. But let's not worry about that. Let's go ahead and talk about something much more interesting. Like I said, the official word, just take a look on the website at school and they'll let you know. Okay, so who just came in? Hold on, I was looking at the other screen at somebody. Hi, Leah, how are you doing? A little bit smaller crowd today, but I can imagine some folks are probably already hustling around trying to get stuff together. I know that hurricanes on everyone's mind. Leah, I was just telling everybody to just, I'm doing well, thank you. I was just telling everybody to keep just looking at the website at school. They'll give you definitive information on school being closed or things like that. So, all right. Okay. Any questions on that? Any questions on Blackboard? Any problems? Any questions on the material? Anything that we need to get out of the way? Anything we need to settle or take care of before we get into business today? Got to finish up 23 and do as much at 24 as we can. We're a little behind, but it's no big deal. We're fine. No questions? Everybody's good? Everybody's ready to go? Everybody's ready to tell me by looking at this graphic right here, they understand exactly what that means. Why am I saying, yeah, okay, why am I saying that only natural selection is one that's purely adaptive and that the other two, and I emphasize this too, are not necessarily adaptive. So why is natural selection the only one that we consider an adaptive evolutionary change, whereas drift and flow are not necessarily adaptive? What's the controlling factor in natural selection versus drift and flow? It'd be a cool name for a song, Drift and Flow. Okay, which one is that important in, Aaliyah? Genetics. Where does genetics play the important part? Is that in both? All right, and more specifically, when you say genetics, give me a little bit more. What do you mean about the genetics? What do you mean about natural selection genetics? What kinds of genes? Okay, so that's the only one. And adaptation involves what Aaliyah's alluding to, right? That it's all, well, genetic mutation, but more importantly, remember, genetic mutation is only one way that you get what really the clay of natural selection is, right? It's variation. Remember, there's genetic mutation, but like for us kind of critters, it's not really so much genetic mutation because remember, that's kind of, remember the dice? That's kind of got to be careful. It's really the crossing over that happens in meiosis where we get most of our variation, right? So yeah, mutation is only one type or one type of variation. But what we're looking at in natural selection, because of a variation of organisms, some of them do better than others. Those are the ones that Alexis said are adapted. Those are the ones that are adapted. All right, really, very good. Now, hi, Sean, how are you? So then if it's differential reproductivity, and I hope that phrase sounds familiar to you, if it's differential reproductivity, that is simply defined those who I'm doing fine, thanks. Those who survive better, leave behind more offspring, all the things we've talked about. What is it that drives genetic drift and flow that makes it not necessarily adaptive? Not necessarily. What's the controlling mechanism there? Remember, these are all three things in which they change. Outside factors such as what, Aaliyah? What outside factors such as what? All these can cause changes in a population frequency. All these would show up on a Hardy-Weinberg as changes if changes did occur. No, it does not. What does it have to do with? How is the... Right, it's exactly random. Of course it is, Alexis. That's precisely what it is. It is random. Those individuals who drift, those birds that make it out to the island, and then, of course, are just basically there or got there by chance, right? There's nothing about their genes that made them any more or well adapted to flying a long distance that a bird of their type would not normally fly. You see what I mean? They got there by luck. There was a tailwind. Woo! We rode the tailwind in, or whatever the case may be, right? So they got there by luck. Now, again, let me emphasize, because it's so important, because this is something that students forget. It's almost like when I was talking about ionic bonds with my students the other day in Bio 1. There's two parts to that, remember. In genetic drift, the reason why we say it's not necessarily adaptive is if those birds get to that island and they survive, right, and they flourish, and then maybe they move to other islands in an archipelago, right, and they begin to find different ways to live amongst each other. One of the reasons that drives change between organisms is competition. If we're butting heads all the time, if you decide, hey, maybe I can eat... Maybe I could eat the seeds a little bit smaller, and you could eat the seeds a little bit bigger. Now, it's no discussion that's done between these animals, of course, but evolution would drive something we call character displacement. Character displacement. Your beak, one group of these organisms, and eventually through time might become a different species, would get bigger beaks, and some would get smaller beaks, and they wouldn't compete for the same resources. It's one of the very good reasons that caterpillars and butterflies do the thing they do. They both eat different things. So caterpillars and butterflies of the same species can live in the same place, right? So, but what I'm trying to say with genetic drift, so if that were to happen, like adaptive radiation, like Darwin's finches, then yes, that's all natural selection. The fact that those birds even survived to begin with, all right, they just, they happen to have that genetic information that allowed them to survive, and then flourish and adapt and move into other environments and perhaps become different species. That's natural selection. The differences in drift, initially what's causing the change, the initial change is purely chance, right? It's like the bottleneck that we talked about. There's a rapid decrease in the population, and it just basically sometimes is something to do with animals being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The cheetahs, the environment changed relatively quickly for them, and where they were distributed, they just found themselves with their pants down. Another way of saying it. They had their evolutionary natural selection pants down. They weren't ready for the rapid change, and they died off. Okay, so that again is more about chance and luck than it is about natural selection. That's the only one that's purely adaptive. So gene flow, of course, is genes moving in and out. So the important thing that you understand is the necessarily adaptive. Only natural selection is completely adaptive. And gene flow isn't exactly a problem that one seems based on. Yeah, of course it does. Sure. No, that's right. Individuals who move into a population who change the genetic information of that population, that switch them Hardy-Weinberg numbers around, which causes evolutionary change. That's the definition. Hi, Patrick. That's the definition of evolutionary change. But those organisms that move in may not be the fittest, okay? It might actually be worse, right? So I was thinking the example of the fish in the two ponds, and they stayed apart, but then there was unusual rain, and they mixed together. Well, the mixing may not have done the organism anything better as far as like the fittest, right? It might have actually been worse. Maybe there were some of the genes that were actually more deleterious in the other population when they mixed. So yeah, absolutely. Not necessarily adaptive, right? Everybody understand that? Everybody good with that? Remember how the whole Hardy-Weinberg thing is based upon that. In Hardy-Weinberg, if you can show that no, there's no evidence of drift or flow or mutation or the lack of random mating than by default natural selection. Everybody good? Yeah, Sean, you're good. Excellent, excellent. All right. Oh, cool. I want to talk about something. This is really kind of neat. And when you look at it, you go, oh, my gosh, it makes perfect sense. We talk about this word fitness, and that's where a while back we were talking when we first discussed natural selection, evolution, Darwinian evolution. We were talking about the survival of the fittest. And I said, yeah, I want, but I'm always a little hesitant to kind of run with that, even though that's a very proper term for it, is because so many people have a misconception of what we mean by the fittest. They think of the fittest as being, the strongest. It's not necessarily the strongest. It's an organism that is best adapted to its environment. So it's a subtle little difference. But fitness is important to understand that it's also relative. Yeah, at that particular time, in that particular population. That's right, Alexis. Absolutely. It's like the old saying, in the valley of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, right? So if you're just happen to be in this particular place at this particular time with something that gives you an advantage, that's why we're going to talk later on about evolution has no goal to it, because it's switching all the time because the world is changing, right? Everything's changing. Okay, let's go to these water striders. If for some reason that the survival in the hole was, or being in the hole to survive, had some genetic thing that could be passed on, right? Otherwise, it's Lamarck. Otherwise, it's luck. Even a pig finds an acorn every once in a while. Lots of people have come in. I'm sorry if I said hello to everybody. I think it's hello to Patrick and Sean. Yeah, I have. Good. All right, back to the water strider. Let's do little numbers here. This is cool because we can look at what we mean by fitness. Right? Because I said it's relative. All right, and I define that down below. Relative fitness, because we're talking about your genetic contribution to the population, to the gene pool, to the genome. Remember that you have a genome. A group of us have a genome. We can talk about a population's genome, a country's genome, an ethnicity's genome, talk about your genome. But your genome, your genetic information, it's your contribution to the future versus everybody else, because everybody's trying to reproduce. And Mother Nature says with differential reproductivity, thou shalt all be allowed to reproduce. Everyone. If you've ever read 1984, Orwell, yes. There's a part in there where the animals are saying, it's a philosophical statement, we're all equal, but some are created more equal than others. It's kind of the same thing. You all get to reproduce, but some get to reproduce more than others, and therein lies the thing, because it's in numbers. So what we're looking at from the left-hand side graph is a plot of the size of an adult female water strider and how many eggs she lays. And no surprise, this is what we call a nice positive linear relationship. The bigger she is, 16 millimeters, okay, the number of eggs she lays goes up, right? Nothing there that we go, that's weird. No, that makes sense. Bigger, you can probably lay more eggs. You can stock more eggs. Females have to get eggs ready, and so on and so forth, right? I'm not sure about water strider maternal care, but bigger water striders, if there's maternal care, might have an advantage in that too. But here's a problem. When you're a big water strider, you're a big, juicy thing for something like a fish to eat. So getting really, really big, 15 millimeters, 16 millimeters, and being just an egg-laying machine is not so good for your survival rate, as we see in the second plot, right? Once you get up around, 14? Once you get a little bigger than about 14 millimeters, man, you are lunch. So, yeah, you lay more eggs on average than anybody else, you 15 millimeter water strider with your about 6 eggs average a day, maybe just a little over. But if you're a 15 millimeter water strider, you're only living about, 20 days. Where's my pencil? There we go. About 20 days. Is this being successfully adapted based off life average or babies conceived? It would be life average and offspring produced. conception, conception is the fertilization, is when the zygote is formed. So we're talking about offspring being produced. So eggs that are actually fertilized and produce offspring. Actually, no. Take that back. You're right. It's just simply staying with eggs. Number of eggs laid during the lifetime. So, I mean, if you put it together, it is, Alexis. I'm sorry. Let's try that one more time. If you put it together in the last part, you see that that's exactly what it is. Fitness has to do with this delicate balance between how much your reproductive output based on your size, and in this particular case in water striders, with how big you are, and mortality. So all those things factor together to give you a graph that's similar to number 3, which says that that with the greatest relative fitness, and this is where I kind of go back to this, be careful thinking fitness is strong, fitness is always big, fitness is fastest, fitness is prettiest, or whatever, fitness is got better feathers, or what seems like better feathers. In this particular case, being bigger is not an advantage, is it, right? If you look at the sweet spot, it looks at about 14 millimeters as a water strider. You're going to be living, wrong pen, Steve. I don't know, 28 days, 29 days, and you're laying 4 eggs a day. So let's see. So do the math. 28 times 4. It's 112, right? And if you're a 15 millimeter water strider, you're living, 20 days, but you're laying 6 eggs. So it's a little bit more 120, but I mean, if you average it all out, you look at the last one, a 14 millimeter water strider in her average lifetime is going to lay somewhere in the vicinity of about 150 eggs. So my math's a little off. That's probably because of the graphs. I'm not reading the graphs exactly right. So that's what we mean by the fitness. So being the 15 millimeter water strider, laying more eggs, but living shorter amount of time, ends up you're going to make fewer offspring. And remember what it's all about in natural selection, right? Remember what it's all about in Darwinian's world of evolution, passing down your genetic information. Now, is being a 14 millimeter water strider, or that being the optimum size, selected for? Yes, absolutely. As Alexis says, that is a successful adaptation. Mother Nature is very Goldilocksian. Not too small, not too big. There's this spot right in the middle where you get to lay a lot of eggs. But if you get a little bit too big, then the fish start going, woo, check you out over there. They see you, right? So you don't want to be too conspicuous. Make sense? I'm sorry, I sort of run around my elbow to get to my thumb, but I think you guys understand, right? So when we talk about fitness, we're talking about something that's very relative, very transitory. Very relative, very transitory. Hi, Philip. Only for now, today, at this particular moment, are you the king. It could all change tomorrow, and it does. How are you today? All right, somebody emailed me a question the other day about one of their assignments and said that they had troubles with this, and good. And I said, well, maybe a lecture will help you understand. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some mice as an example, and those mice are going to vary along a continuum. So it's not discrete variation, right? It's not like we've got green-colored lizards with yellow, red, and then white-bellied lizards. We've got like the horses. So this would be a continuous variation. This would be if you had to predict, and you would be right, obviously, that this is a polygenic trait, that the phenotype, fur color in this mice is polygenic. So if we plotted it, and if you've taken any statistics, if you plotted something that's a continuous variable, you get your old bell-shaped curve that you see there in the picture, don't you? Right? Where most mice, if we're looking at that trait, are sort of average in color, right? Kind of a mixture. There's a few mice that are on the lighter end and a few mice that are on the darker end. Now, how are they born that way? Boom, boom, boom. It's all genetic, right? If a female has a litter of mice, they're not all going to be the same color. There's going to be changes. So that's what we start with. And let's just say that what the population at the top represents would be where we are today. Remember, I said all this fitness and stuff is very transitory. So let's move it. Let's move it a year, 2 years. Some period of time, let's change these organisms' population. Right? Their environment. Because if you don't change their environment, if you don't change the mice's environment there, what would happen to this curve up at the top? This one right here. Would the curve move at all? Would the average colored mouse shift to something different? No, why not? Why not, Aaliyah? Why wouldn't it move? How do I know it won't move? What causes it to move? Just ready to drum roll. Come on, folks, you know it. There you go. Environment, right, Aaliyah? That's right. It's environment. It's all about environment. So some period in the future, let's say a change occurs in the environment. So let's start with the one on the left-hand side. The original population was the black-colored curve, and now we're saying that what has happened is the average has moved off in this particular case towards the darker-colored mice. So what we're seeing here is in natural selection that the relative fitness has shifted from the average colored mouse up at the top, right, the way it was, to the mice that are darker. Now, we could easily come up with an environment where that happens. Let's say these mice lived in an area and there was a series of volcanic eruptions which dumped a bunch of dark colored rock and substrate and stuff all around the environment. And these mice, of course, you would think are prey, especially the flying birds, right, raptors. So that mouse now that's darker in that dark environment would have an advantage, wouldn't it? Now the white arrow on the left, I want to point that out because I want to make sure you understand that while that indicates what is going on, you could get hung up if you're not careful looking at the way the arrow is pointing. That, to me, that arrow indicates that it's selecting against the lighter colored mice. And of course, I've just talked about the fact that in natural selection, in purely adaptive Darwinian natural selection, you can't select against something. You really select for something. And I know that's very subtle, and you're going to give me examples of, well, wait a minute, well, the moth is on the tree, it's a different color. But overall, remember, it's about the slide with the water strider. It's about organisms who have that little difference that allows them to survive into the future. So where the red curve is, I would rather kind of see an up arrow and indicate there's a selective pressure favoring those critters. Remember, that's how it works, differential reproductivity. You favor a phenotype. You favor an organism type. In this case, you're not selecting against the lighter colored mice. You're selecting for the darker colored mice. Subtle, 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 but difference, okay? Now, in the middle is interesting because this is going to be something we're going to talk about in our next chapter. If you get some sort of selective pressure against the middle, maybe we speak in a different term. If you get some selective advantage for those at either end, then you could get something called disruptive selection. And disruptive selection does exactly what it looks like. It just right down the middle of the curve. It actually is a selective pressure against, ergo, no, that's not what I'm trying to say. It's a selective pressure against the average colored mouse, but really more precisely, more technically, a selective advantage for the light and the darker colored mice. Environment changes again, right? Now, why I say this is important for chapter 24, our next one, is because this is how species arise. Remember, all along we have not been talking about making a new species. We've been talking about changing the population. Remember, that's the evolutionary unit, is the population. What we're going to move into chapter 24 is talk about how would something like, for example, disruptive selection, if it continued that way, how would we end up getting the lighter colored mice, the darker colored mice becoming, two separate species, two different species names. So that's a whole different story. Now, on the last one, in stabilizing selection, we say stabilizing because what it does is it favors the average phenotype, right? So it favors the lighter colored mouse. So this is a mouse, presumably, that would live in an environment that probably has, scrubby, sort of desert, sandy kind of look to it, right? So we would be selecting for the average colored mice, but or as you see in the arrows, the arrows are suggesting to you that we're selecting against the light and the dark. But I actually like to think about you understanding the differential reproductivity part of that. Does everybody understand what I mean about those arrows? If you kind of look at it, it's better. To me, it's not better, but it's also important that you understand that it's differential reproductivity. Selective pressure doesn't work against, it's relative. It's kind of like in a group of organisms, if one group of organisms has a selective advantage, Mother Nature doesn't say, oh, you guys that are weak don't get to reproduce, only the strong ones do. Remember, everybody does. It's all a numbers game. It's the only way Mother Nature can control this. It's the only way we can explain this without something directing it, and we know there's nothing directing it. Are we cool? Make sense? I got some neat stuff to talk about now. Some stuff where I love to say, wow, isn't it weird when Mother Nature goes too far? And what I mean by that is everybody thinks that Mother Nature is so perfect and wonderful. And don't get me wrong, I love that. I spent my life studying this Mother Nature biology stuff, but I'm always fascinated by the fact that Mother Nature's making it up as she goes along, right? And sometimes she makes it up wrong. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's talk about sexual selection, first of all. The definition of sexual selection is there are two types. We have intrasexual, and what we mean by that is the males usually do the competing for the females. So this would be the bighorn sheep, like you see on the left. You know, the ones that up, and they ran in each other's heads, and they just kind of stagger back, you know, and you just keep doing that. The one says, I'm done, right? And that's the thing about most of that combat, male combat. Rarely, well, that's a good question for you. Rarely does it end up that the loser fights to the death. All right, rarely does it end up in death. Rarely does it really even end up in serious injury. Usually one of them says, I'll tap out right now. But let me ask you a question for a second. Why do you think Mother Nature would favor intrasexual selection? It's called intra. Intra refers to within, so within a sex, the males are competing. Why do you think Mother Nature would favor male-to-male combat in these critters who do it, like these sheep, these bighorn sheep? Why do you think she would favor that it isn't usually a fight to the death or even a fight to serious injury? Why would that be favored? Why would it be good for the loser to quit while he's ahead, if you will? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Perfect. Of course that's what it is. Yes, that's right. You're getting it. That's exactly what it is. All of these organisms are out there competing, and if you're one on the losing end, you're like, it ain't worth that much. I'll go get stronger, eat some more grass, do whatever I'm going to do, and come back and fight this dude another day, or I'll find somebody weaker. I'm not going to fight to the death, because once I fight to the death, yeah, there you go, Leah, that's right. Once I fight to the death, guess what happens to my Gen X? Boom, out of the equation. It's gone, gone. Now, no matter what I do, I can't pass on my genes. Don't want to do that. All right, here's that little thing about Mother Nature that gets me. Check out that picture on the right. This is a picture of a skeleton of an old deer-like critter. They're called cervids. Cervids are deer, artiodactyls, or no, these are perissodactyls. Sheep, those kind of critters. But this is a male. Look how big that thing is, for one thing, with the guy standing next to it. But if you look at the big horns up there, the rack, you notice that's a pretty good size, isn't it? So if you're a male competing for females with other males, and you're doing it by bam, 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 headbutting, it makes sense that the critter on the right would get those big horns, right? If that's what's giving you an advantage, because we're smacking heads, and I got these big thick horns, and I'm just beating the snot out of you, and you're like, okay, I give. You would think Mother Nature would favor that, right? And if you look at this is not a fake critter. This is a critter. They're extinct now. They're extinct now for reasons you'll find out in a minute. But you would looking at that, holy cow, that's a male, and there's obviously been selection for these big horns, right? Make sense to y'all? That's an explanation that you could agree with, right? Yeah, based on what we know about butting heads and horns and all that. Okay, sometimes Mother Nature goes too far. Why are these animals extinct? Does anyone know? They didn't go extinct too long ago either, but does anybody know why they're extinct? It's by the fact that that's a big... Think about it, that moose size, especially, well, the antlers are bigger than moose size. Moose get some pretty big antlers. Anybody know? There you go. See, what happens when those horns get really, 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 really big? No doubt, man, in combat, you are the king of the walk, but you're also a prey organism. You're not a predator. You're a grazer. So you're doing things like eating on the ground. And when you got them big, heavy horns, that big, heavy rack, it's hard for you to lift your head. And when it's hard for you to lift your head, it's hard to see when someone's coming to get you. When some predators sneak, especially a stealthing predator that sneaks up through the grass on you, and you got those big horns, it's hard moving that head around. So while it might get you a lot of play at the big horned sheep bar, it's not going to help you much when out there in the real world when things are trying to, there you go, getting caught on things. You can see it a lot easier. Its huge antlers were an adaptation to sexual selection, but this is why you always got to remember that Mother Nature, evolution, doesn't have a goal. This is too far. This was selecting for one trait that actually became bad in another form. Oh, Sean, you were talking the other day about acceptations, right? We're going to talk more about that later. This is like an acceptation in reverse, to be honest with you. The acceptations, we'll talk more about those. Acceptations are things that just happen and are fortuitous. Like, oh my goodness, birds. Birds didn't evolve feathers to fly. They evolved them to stay warm. And then they evolved and all of a sudden fight. And that's a good thing. So this is like that in reverse. You know, you're selecting for big horns, but then this poor thing can, like Alex says, you imagine wandering through getting caught in the trees and all that. It must have just been a mess. Right? So bye-bye. Too much. So you can select sexually intra or inter. And in intersexual selection, that's what the birds do. That's where the female selects the male. Typically, the female selects the male. In this particular case of intersexual selection, color is important. Cardinals, we all know. Which cardinal down there is the male? Sure. It's one of the ways that we know certain animals have a sense of color in their vision, or at least a sense of pattern in their vision. That's right, because it's usually the females who do the selecting. The males are more colorful. Now, from a survival point of view, that male is actually putting his neck out by being so bright red, isn't he? So it's kind of like the deer with the big antlers in the previous slide. You don't want to be way showy, now do you? You don't want to be so red that you're spotted from any other bird, from a mile, or any predator from a mile away, So there is always that balance, right? But you want to be showy enough so the females, they're going to want to select you. Now, the females don't got to be showy because you're the one that's got to be putting it out on the line. You're going to show them that you're a good male, that you can reproduce with them, and you can produce a good offspring. And you got good genes because guess what? That female, in many cases, is going to be the one that takes care of the young. In many cases, and there is male paternal care, but in a lot of species of birds, it's going to be the female. She puts most of the effort into it in making the eggs as well as rearing the young. So she wants to make sure that male is, he's got good genes, right? I read a very interesting article a while back. Yeah, can you imagine? Isn't that weird? Isn't that weird? Oh, 2 slides after this, I'll show you another spot where this happens. This is a really good story, too. But I read a story a while back about, oh, crap. Oh, it'll come to me. Anyway, if we look on the left-hand side, this is an example among fish. This is a species of fish here in Florida. The female up above, rather drab, rather plain. The male down below. Okay? These are called bluehead wrasse. Bluehead wrasse, W-R-A-S-S-E, bluehead wrasse. And the females do selecting, and the males are, again, showier. So, once again, I know I was going to talk to you about with the birds. I read a cool paper where they did a study where they looked at the tail feathers of male birds, the symmetry in the tail feathers, and the condition of the tail feathers, whether they were all there, and whether they were ratty or clean or not, or torn up or not torn up. And they looked at that as male success, male reproductive success. They looked at and compared those two. And they found that there was a correlation between the males who had the more pristine tail feathers, they had them all and they were clean and they weren't ripped up, with higher reproductive success. Now, you guys are a bright group. I bet you can get this. Why was that correlated? Why do you think there was higher reproductive success among the males who had much prettier? What was it about the tail feathers? And you might want to say females selected for tail feathers, and they might, but there's another reason. It's not the female selection in this case. It's why the female would select for those feathers and what it means about that bird. She's not into big fancy tail feathers. She just knows when she looks at that, she says, oh, that guy he's hot because his. And why would that be, though? Why would she think that? Really putting a lot of words into birds' heads. That would be one. Okay, go with that, Aaliyah. Not bigger, but go with able to defend themselves. You're on the right path. You're talking about defending themselves against predators. Stick with the predator thing. The animals can bow up and sometimes try to intimidate a prospective predator, but there's another way, and especially if you're a bird, it's a pretty effective way. Leah, it is about protecting themselves. Think about a stalking predator, your cat, coming up on a bird. From which angle does the cat approach your bird? Ah, Caitlin, there you go. What do you mean faster? Faster doing what? From behind, Alexis, you got it. What do you mean, Caitlin, they're faster? Faster at doing what? That's right. So they're on the ground. Along comes Alexis's cat from behind, sneaking up and stalking on the bird. Here it is with my hands, right? And then, of course, the bird, if it gets away at the last minute, flies. Takes to flight, doesn't it? Takes to flight. Now, if the cat or the stalking predator, yeah, Patrick, of course, some of it's sensing too, but the female's going to know if the animal, the male, has nice, pristine feathers. No predator has ever, or few, if any, have ever gotten close enough to even get a hand on him. See what I mean? See, the tail feathers, if you're a cat and you reach out, oh, man, I just almost got him, you're probably going to get you see it in the cartoons, you get a handful of tail feathers, don't you? Well, that's going to show up in the bird. And the female's going to go, oh, look at that dude, man, he's got one tail feather left. There's no way I'm going to mate with him. His genes, he's not so good. He's not very good at sensing or flying or being fast or any of those other things that you were talking about. Isn't that neat? How critters sense that? So they made the correlation. Higher reproductive success because you got prettier tail feathers, which females don't see that as something as pretty, as much as pretty is just like, ooh, that means you get away. And you're quick. Color is important among killer whales, and this is one of my favorite little facts I learned about them when I was studying killer whales at SeaWorld, is this whole dorsal fin thing, right? We know the big thing is about males get the flopped over dorsal fin, and that means they're unhappy, and it really has nothing to do with that at all. If you see the picture I've got there's a couple of birds. This is a wild male animal, a wild male killer whale. Flopped over dorsal fins do occur in the wild. Now, males have taller dorsal fins, more triangular than females. So if you look in the picture up above, you can easily spot the two males. There's a female in the foreground with the sickle-shaped one, and then I think that's probably a juvenile behind her or a young female. All right? Now, the reason why we have this sexual dimorphism amongst these killer whales is because it appears, part of anything, the male dorsal fin is selected for among females. Having a larger, more triangular-shaped male dorsal fin seems to be more attractive. I collected data looking at the height of the dorsal fin as the animals got bigger, and if you look down below, and I always regret because the color should be reversed so we can cut, well, that's sexist. No, they don't have to be that way. Males are red, females are blue, but at about 450 centimeters of length, the male dorsal fin that's the red, starts really growing fast. That's just about the time they become sexually mature. Just about the time males become sexually mature, they put a lot of growth in that dorsal fin. Now, it's kind of like the critter with the big antlers. Dorsal fin gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's not held up by bone. It's held up by cartilage. Cartilage can be strong, but in this particular case, it's not strong enough, and physics wins, and the dorsal fin flips over. Now, we have no reason to believe that having a flopped over dorsal fin anyway decreases the fitness of these animals. They seem to do fine with it. We think in some cases it might just simply be one of those things where Mother Nature pushed the engineering, pushed the physics too far. I do think it's interesting, though, that their male dorsal fins start growing much quicker at about the time the males start becoming sexually mature. So Thought that was neat. So size is important in this particular case. Now, was it Alexis or somebody was saying something about, oh, selection and it's bad for you? Sexual selection and it's bad, or, you know, doing the right thing for sexual selection could be bad for another thing. It was like the guy with the antlers. Does anybody got any questions about that before I go on? Yeah, that's right. This is cool. These are Tungara frogs, and these are fringe-lipped bats who obviously feed upon Tungara frogs, as this picture shows. This is one of those very cool stop photograph caught in, you know, look at, oh man, look at the fingers. Isn't that neat? Look at the fingers in the bat. That's a beautiful shot. But obviously what's going on is this bat feeds upon the frogs. So, you know, now frogs call, we know why frogs call for the males. I think it's usually always males, or may not be in every case, but male frogs are usually the callers, and male frogs call for the same reason that female birds sing, and the same reason female birds are showy, because they're trying to attract females, right? You hear it at night, especially after it rains. Do I have my marbles? Oh no, they're at school. Remind me in lab to show you the marbles. Click 2 marbles together. Next time you're out by a swamp after it rains, listen and see if you hear that same sound. There's a frog that makes exactly the sound of 2 marbles click, 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 clicking together. All right? The chorus frog. So that's why I was saying for your field notebook. So if you got some marbles clicking together, it's exactly the same sound. All right, so this frog is swooping down on this frog, and all he's trying to do is call, hello, any females out there for me, right? So what's the frog do, Sean? You're right. Because when he's calling, especially the bigger, heavier frogs, the bat knows that's the big meaty one. So they're starting zooming in on these guys' calls. So what do you think the frog's going to have to do, Sean? Or maybe what I should do. But then the female won't find you. Remember, she's got to find you too. Now, maybe I shouldn't say this frog, but maybe this population of frogs. What is it they're going to do if they're going to survive? Get eyes in the back of their head. That's probably not going to happen. Call it a frequency the bats can't hear. I don't know, man. They can hear a lot of different frequencies. Well, they came up with a simpler solution. Call and move. Call and move. So the Tungara frog gives a little frog call. Yeah, see, that's the problem too. It's always that way, isn't it? It's a dog-eat-dog world. We're all wearing milk-bone underwear. But anyway, the male calls and then moves a little bit. Not so far that the female won't find him, but he calls hoping to move just out of the way of the bat. So he calls and moves, calls and moves, calls and moves around this area, and that's an adaptation to these guys getting polished off every time they were out looking for a little action at the frog bar. All right? These bats came down and swooped them up. How do they? Well, they do through natural selection, and what they do is they secrete a material on their skin that makes them poisonous, like poison dart frogs in South America. They're called that because the Indians used to take their dart arrows, tip them on the skin of the frog, and it was a curare. Isn't that a bleeding, causes you to bleed to death or something like that, if I remember right? But frogs do that because it prevents predation. Yes, that's correct. That's right. Very good, Sean. Yeah. Another great example of the interplay between the environment of an organism and survival, right? Eating that material allows them to secrete that poison. If your dog sometimes will mess around with a frog, many species of frogs and toads can secrete some level of that material, and sometimes the frog, the dog, you can see that the mouth will be frothing and all that stuff, and that's because they got a mouthful of that stuff. There you go. And another very weird story, there's the cane toad. Everybody ever heard of the cane? C-A-N-E? We don't have cane toads in Florida. No, I don't think they're natural. They're native anyway. Cane toads. This is when I was in college. Down arrow because they're bad, or down arrow because you never heard of them? I think it just shows the silliness of humans and just what it is. When I was in college, there was a report, and it had to come from some graduate student's lab. Somebody was looking at the material on the surface of the cane toad and found out it was hallucinogenic. And so the big thing was to sit around and lick toads. No thanks. Yeah, look it up. I can't remember if it was just found. Well, actually, I think it was just discovered by God knows why. But as students, we also said, you know what that was? It had to have been some college student looking at it looking at the chemical makeup and recognize the hallucinogenic properties to it or something like that. So, because come on, licking a toad? God. I like toads, but I'm not gonna lick them. Have you? I know it's weird. With all this talk about whittling down and fitness and relative fitness and this, differential reproductivity, you might think that after a while everything becomes perfect, right? That everything is there's not going to be any variation. That if really there is only one small region of phenotype that allows you to survive, whether it be color and size or whatever trait you want to pick, we all ought to look alike after a while, but we don't, do we? And thank goodness that we don't. We're variable. We're variable because of Mother Nature's variable, because the environment changes. Now, did living things arise and evolve and flourish because they knew the world would change? No. No, it's just the way it happened, you see. There are certain things about the way we inherit that make us always, or give us variability. It's the variability. If there's no way to make variability, nothing of this happens, okay? So one of the ways that variability is maintained, I've already kind of mentioned to you, is the fact that we're diploid, right? And those of us that are, not all of us are. But if you're diploid, you have that recessive allele. Now it's hidden. Hidden, what I mean is presumably it can't be selected for or against. It's ignored. But in some future environment that may or may not ever happen, that could be beneficial. It reminds me of when my mother died. My dad gave me this huge cotton bag of pennies that she had been collecting, just pennies, certain that they would be worth a ton of money. My children and I went that bag of pennies. Not a single one of them was worth any more than say 5 or 6 cents. My poor mother never understood those pennies would be worth something in 5,000 years, but not in merely just about 100 years. They're pennies. So, right, hidden from selection. She was hiding those pennies, think they'd be worth value. She had no way of knowing maybe there would be a penny shortage in the year 2000, right? So we don't know if those recessive alleles are going to be beneficial, but they might be. And natural selection very often, in terms of balanced selection, for one reason or another, maintains these frequencies of two or more phenotypes. It kind of stabilizes it. So organisms aren't always of one type. And let me show you what I mean by that, this idea of being diploid. This actually, I have to fix this. This should fit up here. I'm sorry. That's an example of being a diploid and having variation being an advantage, okay? So I need to fix that slide. Give me 1 second. Let me do that while I'm sitting up because I meant to do it last semester and I forgot. So if I don't do it now. So that is a type of heterozygote advantage, or a type of diploid advantage is heterozygote, and a type of polymorphism is frequency selection. There you go. Much better. All right. So let's take a look at being diploid. This is a cool story. Malaria and sickle cell anemia. There's a relationship between them, and this is called heterozygote advantage. So this is that thing where having that recessive allele became valuable. Can you imagine going back because they said, yeah, I know, yeah. Yeah, very few countries make. My son was telling me the reason we make pennies is to keep zinc manufacturers in business, because pennies are made of zinc, really, not made of copper. When we get to protozoans, and we're going to take a look at microscope slides. Does anybody know what these red, purplish dots are? You recognize those from any time you looked at a microscope? Those are blood cells. Yes, Philip. Now notice this one. Well, it's weird, doesn't it? All these little purple dots in it. Those little purple dots, well, those little purple dots are stain that stained the reproductive cycles of that mosquito up above. You see that mosquito up above, which is the Anopheles mosquito, is the mosquito that carries, now there are more than one species of Anopheles, but it's the mosquito that carries the blood parasite, specifically a protozoan that causes malaria, the disease malaria. The protozoan's name is Plasmodium. And we'll take a look at it when we get to protozoans here in a couple of weeks. But what you're seeing in that red blood cell is an infected red blood cell. That red blood cell has become the unwitting robot of those little parasites that are inside. And those little parasites are going to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce, and eventually it's going to cause that red blood cell to lyse, to split, and all of them are going to go out and infect other red blood cells and infect other red blood cells and so on and so forth. That's malaria. That's a problem, of course, okay? Now, the mosquito uses the human being in order to complete its reproductive cycle. You see, what the mosquito needs, the protozoan does, it uses the mosquito. The mosquito bites the human, so this is kind of in a if we looked in a bigger picture, the mosquito bites the human and injects his little proboscis, his nose, okay, proboscis, his nose. Now, blood, of course, has the natural tendency, oh, that may not be spelled right, but that's close, to clot, of course. So when the mosquito sticks his proboscis into you, your blood wants to clot. Now, the way that mosquitoes and bloodsuckers, ticks, and all them other wonderful critters that we love to talk about, the way they get that blood to flow is they inject a little bit of an anticoagulant into your body, which causes the blood to flow. They get their meal like this guy is doing, and they fly off amongst their way. The itching that you feel afterwards, the mosquito bite, is actually an allergic reaction to that stuff that the mosquito injected into you, that anticoagulant. All right, now, when the mosquito takes a blood meal, if you have malaria, part of the blood it takes with it is going to be blood with those little parasites inside. But these parasites have now evolved to parasites that can reproduce inside the mosquito. So when they get inside the mosquito, they reproduce. You see, when the red blood cells are lysing and they're going out and infecting other red blood cells, they're asexually reproducing. But they also sexually reproduce inside the mosquito. Mosquito draws the protozoan into its body. They sexually reproduce inside of there. The mosquito goes and bites another organism, another critter, injects a little bit of that anticoagulant, bloop, and in that anticoagulant is the protozoan parasite. So the human is the host for this mosquito. We call those kinds of things that move disease around like that a vector. Mosquitoes are vectors, rats are vectors, a dog could be a vector, rabbit, you could be a vector. You can carry disease. Well, what does this have to do with sickle cell anemia? We learned in Bio 1 that sickle cell anemia is a genetic trait. And folks with sickle cell anemia, if we do a very simple sort of, genotype thing, we might imagine that this person does not have sickle cell anemia. It's a recessive disorder, like a lot of disorders are, and that person does. And this person has sickle cell anemia trait. Now, in this particular case, having sickle cell anemia trait, that hidden allele isn't hidden completely in terms of phenotype. People with sickle, and this is one of the things we're learning more and more, if you have sickle cell anemia trait, you are still subject to the symptoms of sickle cell anemia. And one of the things is you can have spleen problems. It's anemia. You don't get as much oxygen. You can have organ death. Folks with sickle cell anemia trait can experience that sometimes in low oxygen environments. Say they went to Colorado and were engaging in heavy physical activity. An NFL football player years ago, Ryan Clark, I believe he did not know that he had sickle cell anemia trait, went to go play from Pittsburgh, went to go play a game in Denver and lost his spleen, almost died. Now, if you have sickle cell anemia, of course, then the problem you got is you got sickle-shaped red blood cells, and that, of course, back to what you learned about in Bio 1. What's the heterozygote advantage? Let's do the numbers game. If you are normal, homozygous dominant, right, you're going to live a certain amount of time, X amount of time, but malaria is probably going to get you, especially back in history. Malaria wiped out all kinds of people. Lots of mosquitoes, lots of humans, and unfortunately. If you have sickle cell anemia, you're going to live a period of time, but you're going to die younger because of SCA, sickle cell anemia. However, if you have the trait, you are immune to malaria, Right? Nope, no problem for me. I was supposed to say malaria. And as far as sickle cell anemia goes, unless you find yourself in one of those stressed environments, you're going to be fine. So if we do the numbers game between those two, and remember what I've said about the water strider and differential reproductivity, who's going to produce more offspring in their lifetime? The person who's homozygous dominant, who doesn't have any symptoms of sickle cell anemia, or the person who's homozygous recessive, or is it the heterozygote? Who's going to live longer? Think about the environmental pressures. That's right, Aaliyah. They're going to live longer. They don't have to worry about malaria. They're immune to it. Something about being the heterozygote. Something about being heterozygous, about having sickle-shaped red blood cells impedes, I'm sure you can find it online, the exact reason, impedes the spread of the parasite. So those individuals don't have to worry about that. Now, they do have sickle cell anemia, but they don't have it to the extent that's probably going to affect their lives to someone who has full-blown sickle cell anemia. Is not going to live as long. So if we do the water strider thing, somebody with the sickle cell anemia trait might leave behind 6 children, whereas the other individual died of malaria early and only left behind 3, and that's sickle cell anemia left behind 1, right? Interesting thing about this, and the detective part, and this is what I love doing, this detective work and how to use biology. When we fast forward to today, we find that sickle cell anemia is found more probably more high rates in certain ethnic groups than others. Does anybody know what ethnic group suffers from higher rates of sickle cell anemia than others? I'm sure you do, but maybe you don't know why. That's right, African Americans, specifically African Americans and folks of Mediterranean descent around this area. That's actually something that was interesting. When I was younger, they were learning that folks, Italian and Greeks like that, could also have sickle cell anemia. So, usually we only diagnose it in African Americans. Now, the reason why that is all back to environment. If you look at the spread of sickle cell anemia, if you look at the incidences of sickle cell anemia, that's the red with the highest concentration being on the west and the east coast, and you look at the hatched lines, which is the spread of where that mosquito is found, Plasmodium falciparum, which causes malaria, you find that they overlap, right? So the overlapping of the mosquito, which is the environmental pressure, overlapped over the different genotypes. And the fact that the heterozygote genotype had an advantage, easily placed together and explains, I got so excited there, explains like when we fast forward to today, we see higher rates of that in folks from that ethnicity, because of course that gene has actually been selected for through time. Yes, absolutely. Of course you do. That's right. Because when 2 heterozygotes mate, remember you got a 1 in 4 chance of having someone with sickle cell anemia. So absolutely. And of course, when we look today among African Americans, there's no need to worry about being immune to malaria because we don't suffer from malaria. But that trait through time, of course, and especially when you go back hundreds of years, folks usually bred with folks that were near them, so ethnicities tend to stay within the same area, until we had the ability to float around the world and fly around the world and do that other stuff. I think that's an interesting piece of detective work, and it's also an interesting story of how variation, dances on the edge. All you got to do is get an edge. Now, nobody would say that having the trait for sickle cell anemia is an advantage unless you understood what the environmental pressure was at that point, right? Isn't that neat? Okay, the other way that we maintain a variation is not just being diploid, but this thing called polymorphism, where we have 2 or more different phenotypes in the population that kind of flex back and forth. These are water boatmen, insects that fish love to eat. In this particular case, we call it frequency-dependent selection because the selection of the organisms by the predator depends upon the frequency. Specifically, if you look along the x-axis, as you become more frequent in the population, what I mean by you, whatever color water boatman you are, same species, but there are light ones and medium ones and dark ones, as you become more frequent in the population, fish eat you more. Now you might think, well, of course, that makes sense. There's just more of them around. But that's only part of it. Fish, I love fish, studied fish all my life. Wouldn't call them the brain surgeons of the animal world, right? Many, although some are pretty doggone bright. But fish get focused sometimes. They what we call a fixed action pattern. They go, I eat dark brown water boatmen. There's lots of them. Don't eat anything but that. And so they focus and focus and focus and focus. And they eat those and they eat those until the point when, guess what? Ain't no dark brown water boatmen anymore. Or there's very few of them. So now who's the most in the population may be the medium brown ones, or it could be the light brown ones. And so that the organism, the fish, uses its simple little mind to go medium brown water boatman, medium brown, medium brown. So that's why I put in the red. In this particular case, if you're rare, you have the advantage, right? You don't want to be the most obvious one in the population. This is sometimes a little different than when we think about the organism that stands out in a population. You know, oh gosh. The old Gary Larson cartoon, The Far Side, where the deer is born with a birthmark and it looks like a bullseye, and the two deer are talking to each other in the woods, and he goes, oh, that's a bummer of a birthmark, Hal. Right? So organisms, you know, it generally, you don't want to stand out in a crowd. But in this particular case, because the crowd, the fish, tend to prey or tend to focus on those that are most numerous, you kind of do want to stand out in the crowd. You don't want to look like everybody else. Let's see. So would the fact that the fish actually choose which color to eat randomly make the color changes of the bowman not natural selection? No. What? Okay, why do you say that first, Sean? Let me read the question again. Why you actually choose which color choose? The predator prey, that can be an environmental pressure. But randomly, what do you mean randomly make the color? If we don't entertain, if it's visibility or whatever it is, in other words, what it is that makes these fish center on the dark brown water boatman, if it's simply the fact where my dad ate them and his dad ate them or something ridiculous like that, but we focus on the fact that if you're not being preyed upon in those high numbers, that means you're living longer, and go back to the water strider, so you're reproducing more. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? So it's not so much that that fish is, it's who the fish is ignoring that's causing the evolution to change. That's why the lighter brown and the medium brown are growing in size, because they're not being polished off. Which color do you make the color change? So that would be natural selection, because it's still differential reproductivity. See, even if you get, yeah, right? Even if you get polished off more, you don't live as long. And if you don't live as long, you don't. That's why I'm glad you asked those questions too, because it's always so important in evolution to not get. It's so easy to slip in this idea of survival of the fittest and all this kind of stuff, and it is all about reproduction. You know, the dark brown water boatmen, you know, they have the disadvantage, but the advantage that the light brown water boatmen have in this particular case is just that there ain't a lot of them. Sometimes the advantages can be something a little more than just stretching your neck, you know. Well, this is a cool story. There are certain fish out there that eat the scales of other fish. It's hard to believe that you could get enough nutrition off of a scale, but indeed these fish, and I don't remember what the genus name is, but you can see up above, it's P. microlepus. They're born in two types. See, remember what we're doing here is we're trying to balance out different forms. So on the water boatman, it's going to shift each time in terms of the dark and the light and the medium. And in this case, we're going to shift back and forth, so we never get rid of what we call the left mouth and the right mouth. And if you look, that's exactly what it is. I was trying to look for a picture of these fish. Their mouth actually turns one way, and it's or the other way. And they're born either one or the other. Let's see if I can find this picture. Flatfish do it too. I can't find a good picture right away. I'm getting a lot of flatfish. But if you look at the way these fish make their living, they swim up on this fish in the middle, and they go in and they pick a scale off. All right. Well, the fish in the middle, you have your scales for a reason. Number one, maybe it hurts to have them pick the scales off, but scales protect you and do a lot of vital functions. That's why fish have them. You don't want these guys swooping in them and eating them. I remember I was in a lake one time just kind of floating in the water, and a little bass came up and nipped on a small little mole I have in my back. My God, that hurt. I guess he thought it was a little insect. But the whole story in all of this is, of course, if you're the fish in the middle, you're going to defend against these fish. So when there's more left-mouthed P. microlepis, you're going to defend to the right. And when in the population that you live in has more right-mouthed P. microlepis, you're going to defend to the left. Everybody follow me? Right? You're going to be more inclined to kind of be twitchy to the one side in which there are more fish coming at you that are trying to eat your scales from. So if you got 80% of the fish in the population on left mouth, you're always looking to the right, because there's only 2 chances out of 10 they're coming from the other side. So if we follow down the graph below, oh my God, this is so cool, from 1981 to 1990, and then we look at the frequency of just the left-mouthed individuals, 0 to 1, 0 to 100%. So we don't have to look at the left mouth because the opposite is the right mouth. So if we look at the left-mouthed individuals in 1981, they made up a higher proportion than the right mouth. They were at, was it 58%, 0.58, something like that? Okay, and then if we go to 2 years later, we notice that actually the frequency has shifted and now favors the other, right? So we're looking at maybe 42% of the left mouth, and the right mouth has increased. Now, the green arrow that you see right there, the green arrow represents the reproduction of the left-mouthed individuals. And of course, when reproduction is low in 1981, then there are fewer of them born. Now, since there are fewer of them born, that means they're, relatively speaking, there's no more right-mouthed. So guess what the fish is going to do that was looking to the right? He's now going to start looking to the left more, because there's more of the right-mouthed ones. Oh, they're coming from the left, coming from the left, coming from the left. So I defeat against them. These poor guys, these right-mouthed fish that are trying to get a meal and can't because these fish are know where they're coming from. Guess who's getting the meal? The left-mouthed individuals. Then fish starts going back to the right. And the right mouth, and up and down and up and down and up and down it goes. Now, you don't ever get rid of one. You don't ever get rid of the left mouth. You never get rid of the right mouth. They stay in, and you can see it. Boom, boom. They bounce around 50% from 81 to 90. So almost 10 years. Isn't that neat? Isn't that cool? So basically, it's just, you know, you don't have ever a perfect organism. You can't. Because everything changes, and sometimes it can change so subtly. It can change so subtly and simply just the behavior of a fish that eats your scales. And of course, you know, it just makes sense. If you defend more to one side than the other fish is going to have the advantage. And they're going to be able to get more scales. And they're going to have, see, in this particular case, it's kind of like the giraffe with the higher, longer neck could reach the browse, and that was the resource it had. In this particular case, not being defended against as much, right? Like if you're left mouth and the fish is looking to towards the right mouth ones, toward the left, you get to feed more. It's just amazing. You really sometimes have to tease these things apart to figure out where the selection is happening, what's causing the selection. So to finish this chapter, I want to just kind of put it all in a nutshell about what evolution and natural selection and evolution by natural selection tries to do in this idea of creating perfection. That's never going to happen. For one thing, evolution is limited by the past. You can't start all over again. In other words, whatever structure you have now, you've got to work with that. Or as my father used to always say, you got to dance with the one that brought you, or you got to play with the cards that were dealt you. I've heard engineers and physiologists describe the fact that the back problem in humans was not inherited, but came about because we learned how to be bipedal, walking on 2 legs. That if you had to do it all over again, that the back could be designed a little better, would limit those kinds of back problems. Well, that's too bad because we didn't start out bipedal, so we had to kind of go with that. You've learned throughout this this chapter, especially in the last couple of slides, that you never get everything you want. Adaptions are compromises, right? Anytime you compromise, you don't get everything. You don't get perfection. Would be 100%. You can't do that. Sometimes it's just luck, right? Evolution is just luck. We talked about that. Genetic drift, flow can just sometimes be organisms moving in and out. That's not going to create a perfect critter. As Alexis pointed out, right? Yeah, I'm thinking Alexis, you pointed out the idea that those organisms that move in may not necessarily have the best genes, right? That's not natural selection. And we can't do Lamarckism. You can't expect selections to exist, come up on demand. You can't say, boy, it'd be really good if these mice would evolve darker colored fur to live in this darker environment. That's just not the way it is. So if for some reason you got a species of mouse that phenotypically is constrained, that can't grow dark fur, can only grow light fur, and this volcanic eruption occurs, and these mice are scurrying around, and there's no dark ones to get an advantage, what happens to them? What happens to those mice? You know, it's now a dark background. Yeah. That's usually what happens, isn't it? Remember I told you that. That's usually what happens. Extinction. Now, I only got 10 minutes, but that's good because it gives me just enough time. Does anybody have any questions about 23 to just get you started and get you salivating about chapter 24? Again, I don't know anything about the hurricane. I haven't looked on the website since we started class, but that's going to be your best source of information. So if you join me late, please check that as far as school closure and stuff. All right, so far all we've talked about, all we've really discussed, Darwin's finches. And Darwinian. I love that little graph down below, yeah. You think so? I think that's probably has a lot to do with what we've done to the climate, what we've done to the ocean. The ocean is unseasonably warm right now. And that's because of all these things that we talk about, that we know about. 97% of all climatologists know about. Global climate change, let's call it, because it's not always warming. It's global climate change. But now define this for me. Microevolution versus what we're going to talk about today in this chapter, which is macroevolution. Micro is small. Microevolution is just what we've been through, right? A population changing. Just a population. We're going to now expand that to macroevolution. Now we're going to talk about how do we get different species? How do we get different families and orders? How do we get the diversity on Earth that you see in the picture down below? And that's kind of a cool little representation of what we call this bush of life, right? So down at some time in the past, and there's the dashed line, there was this, what we call the Universal Common Ancestor, right? The UCA, the Universal Common Ancestor. And then through time, that diverged, and some lineages didn't go all the way. They went extinct. And if we go up to the present time, we're going to see a lot of these phylogenetic charts in a couple of chapters. But I think it really does a beautiful job of showing what we're talking about here. How did we start from that single branch at the bottom and begin to branch out? How did Darwin's finches go from that one group of finches? And remember, Ernst Mayr said it could have been just an a fertilized female, right? How did they go to all the different species in this picture? There's 13, but I think it's 15 or 17 now. So in other words, how did this little tiny changes in population that we've been talking about follow through this very circuitous route back and forth through time, changing through evolution, minor changes in microevolution? How did that eventually end up creating all this diversity, right? Different families and orders. How? Slow. Very slow. Right? Even when it goes, that's not how you spell macroevolution, by the way, but you know. Even when it goes fast, it's slow. All right, it's relative. And that's why you know now that I spent so much time in that first chapter talking about the geology. That was so important to Darwin's theory. Without that support of the geology that the world was older than 6,000 years, it's gone, right? It just throws it out the window. There's even a couple of quotes that I put in here where folks have written about some of the problems that Darwin knew he had with some of the evidence even back then. Up above is something from back in the 19th century, around Darwin's time. T.H. Huxley was a friend of Darwin's. And so he's writing, about Darwin, and he says about this whole theory of evolution that if the gaps between organisms, in other words, if Aristotle was right, if it was rungs on a ladder, if species A and species B were immutable, it had always been A, it had always been B, it never had been the same, and all, back to that chart I showed before, if it hadn't been a branch like that, if that could show that those gaps were always there, then that would destroy Darwin's theory, right? Because that's the whole point of Darwin's theory, that the world has changed and organisms had changed to adapt to it. So if we know the world has changed and geologists tell us that it is, then obviously organisms have to have changed as well. So they weren't immutable. So there are rungs between the latter. Sorry, Aristotle, you're a smart guy, but you're not right on this one. A little later on in the chapter, I'm going to talk about something called the Cambrian explosion. Now, it's nothing exploded about 520 million years ago, MYA, since we're becoming so, paleontologically oriented here, MYA. About 520 million years ago, if we look at the fossils, you remember how Lamarck looked at them, or remember how fossil or paleontologists do, you look at them at layers. If we get to the layer of rock, which we can date, right? About 500 million years ago, there's this explosion of biological diversity. People have written books about this thing, the Burgess Shale, which is all about these fossils that you find from this area in Canada from around this time period. Prior to 520 or so million years ago, there were a few life forms. The sponges were around, the jellyfish, some of the relatively simple ancestors of some of the critters. But for the longest period of time, for about 1 billion years or so, there wasn't really a lot going on. There was evolution, but about 500 million years ago, the world just went crazy. We had this rapid diversification of biology. And we're going to talk when we get to that chapter about why that happened. So that's what we mean by the Cambrian explosion. And since our ability to date fossils and make inferences back during Darwin's time wasn't all that good, it looked as if to Darwin, with him looking at the fossil record, that these organisms all came on the scene at once. This coincident appearance. Right? Now, if that is the case, if that was coincident appearance of almost all of these life forms that we have on Earth today, Darwin's theory is again out the window. Because even though Darwin knew that the world was old, this whole idea of these organisms coming on the at the same time, and again, it looked to him, it was actually about 150 million years, but from what he could look at, it looked a lot faster than that. He knew that his theory wouldn't support that. He knew that the theory he had in place, the theory that we support today, he was right, you see, but that did cause him consternation. You can see right there. Nothing bothered him more than this Cambrian explosion. Everything is, see, Darwin only stood that evolution works slow, that the speed or the pace of evolution was slow, methodically slow, just like the geologists were talking about. But what he didn't understand was, as we're going to learn, evolution can, through natural selection again, Darwin, can work relatively fast sometimes, relatively. So instead of, like 1 million years, that's what I mean by relatively fast. Okay, little tiny steps, and we get different organisms, which is different species, which is easy enough, right, to define. We learned different species back when we were first learning to identify things. Horse, duck. We looked at them and they looked different. They learned morphological differences. Right, so that's easy enough. Morphology means form or shape. Now we look at things that involve not only the way they look, but the way they work, physiology, where they came from. Phylogeny is family, so we're looking at that tree again, and what they do in the environment, in ecology, their job, or what sometimes folks call their niche. We talked about niches, organisms that are the stalking predators and all that stuff. Now we have an official definition for a species. I'm going to give this to you, and then I'm going to let you guys kind of chew on that for the next couple of days before we get back together, because I'm going to try to blow your mind when it comes to the definition. Here's what Ernst Mayr says is a species. It's a population, a group of population whose members have the potential to interbreed. They have the potential with each other, and they produce viable, living, fertile offspring that can reproduce themselves. Now in red, you're not the same species if you can produce offspring, or, excuse me, you're not the same species just because you can produce offspring. Mayr says to be able to do that, you got to produce viable, fertile offspring. If you don't produce viable, fertile offspring, then you're different species. So here's what I'm going to let you chew on. Horse on the left, donkey on the right. Two different species, right? Look at the names. Equus caballus, Equus asinus. Now down below you see a name that maybe you haven't seen before, a scientific name. The little X means that these organisms below are hybrids. That's what the X means. Now they're hybrids. What do we call critters down below that are a mix of a horse and a donkey? Exactly what you call them. And what do we know about mules? Other than the fact that they're stubborn, and they're big, and they're strong. What do we know about mules? And yep, most all mules, we'll talk about why I said most later on, but they can't reproduce. So back to my definition with Meyer, are a horse and a donkey the same species or different species? In other words, do you support the fact that they have two separate names here? Are they two separate species? Yeah, absolutely, Sean. Look, right there. Cannot produce viable fertile offspring with members of other species, means you're different species. Horses and donkeys are closely related, same genus, so they're close. That's why they can reproduce at all, but they generally don't produce fertile offspring, generally. All right, that's all I got for today. Everybody stay safe in the hurricane. Keep an eye on the website, whatever it says. I will be on campus tomorrow, and I will have office hours, just like I normally do. So if you want to see me on campus, or you're more than welcome to stop by. But not all of them.